Hello, Philobogan here. To my fellow workers in the vineyard, worldwide, greetings. Our talk today is titled, Counterfeminism is more predictive than prescriptive. Counterfeminism, at its core, is predictive rather than prescriptive. It may be reckoned as a prediction-driven political formula which undertakes to foretell the course of developments, to spot emerging trends, and to harness the energy of these things in a profitable manner. Counterfeminist prediction is built upon a close analysis of feminism's occult operational structure, and takes into account both the constraint which that structure imposes and the consequences which are likely to arise from it. As we never tire of saying, certain things may be predicted. Men as a group have felt the revolutionary impact of the women's movement over the last half-century, and it would be predictable that male behavior on average would show evidence of this. The opposite, that male behavior on average would show no evidence of this, would not be predictable. Well, it'd be pretty damned unlikely. Continued unchecked growth of feminist plans and policies in the form of perpetual revolution will predictably force a growth of dysfunctional behavior among the male population at large, and the female population as well. But that's another story. The dysfunctionality will take many forms, only some of which can be directly traced to feminist influence, with the bulk of it owing to secondary environmental pressures which feminist innovation has originally set in motion. Eventually, the growth of perpetual revolution will culminate in the rise of oppositional forces. How? What forces? The short and simple answer is that perpetual revolution will force the growth of its own contrary energy, which will eventually take the form of political consciousness among a much larger group of men and women than at present. All of this comes into focus when you consider that perpetual revolution operates contrary to nature. Nature has an elastic limit which dictates how far it can be distorted. Once approaching that limit, perpetual revolution slows to a crawl. Finally, it hits a brick wall and can travel no more. And as I have explained elsewhere, perpetual revolution cannot stand still. Whether moving forward or running in reverse, it is imperative that perpetual revolution remain in motion. Therefore, when forward momentum is blocked, perpetual revolution can do none other than run in reverse. And when that happens, it is no longer devouring the world, but rather devouring itself, which is a limited and self-defeating food supply. It is worth asking why feminism, being contrary to nature, can even make such headway in the world at all. One explanation is that feminist polemic cuts a swath through its challengers because it seems morally intimidating. Yet the only reason it seems morally intimidating is because it presents a tangle of incoherency, and incoherency cannot be rationally answered. One is overpowered by lightning-swift illogic and rendered voiceless. Feminism is incoherent because it tells 100 different stories about itself, and those stories very often contradict each other. In fact, this is very clever because the mass of contradiction makes a perfect smokescreen. However, once feminism's hidden coherency is drawn to the surface by means of counter-feminist analysis, the shabby trick is seen, and the power of moral intimidation vanishes. This lack of rationality or coherency deserves a closer look. It is in fact the irrationality of a cancer, a neoplasm. Upon reflection, It is not so much irrational as driven by an alien logic. It might not seem rational that a neoplasm would destroy the host body and thereby destroy itself also, but when you consider that this is exactly the nature of a neoplasm, it makes perfect sense. It is what neoplasms do. They destroy their host surrounding and eventually themselves. No point in asking why. It is simply a neoplasm's natural purpose to behave so. And there is nothing irrational about fulfilling your natural purpose. You mustn't expect a cancer to think the same way you do. It is fully coherent within itself, upon its own terms, even if those terms are not openly admitted. Feminism, by reason of its deception, advances a greater political distance in the world and might seem credible if mere honesty were the only force in play. But finally, the order of nature, by which I mean especially human nature, rises up to challenge feminism's passage in the manner which I have outlined. It is important to recognize that the cleverness of feminism's deception will not check the eventual uprising, for once a certain tipping point has been reached, the developed oppositional energy will irresistibly force its passage through the inhibiting overburden of alien logic. Reality is pushing back against actuality. Two different logics, mutually alien, at a point of confrontation where logic is annihilated as a channel of transaction, leaving only brute force to settle the issue. And this outcome, as I have explained many times, is apt to be ugly. A blind explosion of pent-up fury punching its way out of a box. For there is nothing civilized or even entirely rational about punching your way out of a box. Truly, it is a messy and destructive endeavor. But when you reflect that confinement to a box can only breed ignorance, and that ignorance can only breed ill-advised action, that should come as no surprise. My advice to everybody, everywhere, is to stand well clear when the predictable punching gets started. Do this, and you'll have naught to fear. Admittedly, those who have a vested interest in the box will be unhappy about the turn of events, but I am trying to warn them also, since they are the ones most likely to be in harm's way. Forces of nature are not to be trifled with. So once again, counterfeminism is predictive rather than prescriptive, and it foretells the growth of dysfunctional male behavior due to the direct or indirect influence of feminist innovation. Counterfeminism asserts that the growth of feminist plans and policies operates contrary to nature, and that sooner or later this growth will encounter the brick wall of natural constraints, which will in turn reverse the energy of feminism's perpetual revolution, forcing feminism as an ideology and as a movement to consume itself. The elastic limit of nature logically encompasses the elastic limit of human nature, specifically people, meaning men at first, but more and more women also as time goes on, will either rebel openly against feminist requirements or quietly subvert the more indirect forms of feminist influence. This will be like the construction of countless roadblocks, both large and small, directing certain traffic back to its point of origin. We need to understand why counterfeminism is more predictive than prescriptive. The expression signifies that counterfeminism merely sees but does not summon what it foretells. To predict a thing means only to bespeak its arrival in advance, whereas to prescribe a thing means to issue a command or at least a suggestion that the thing should happen. This distinction is crucial. Allow me to explain. In theory, it would be possible for the present speaker or any other agitator in the community to simply retire from the game and disappear. It would even be possible for all of us at once to hang up our spurs and say, "Que sera, sera. What will be, will be." And what might follow? That is a question of the first importance, and our answer takes the form of a prediction. The feminists, after a fleeting interval of puzzled silence, would simply pick up their tools and take up where they left off. Perpetual revolution would go right on as if nothing had ever happened. For that is exactly what our movement means to them. Nothing. Or at any rate, nothing more than a speed bump. And so it is for any mechanical device of any sort. The device predictably does what it does, and whatever is extraneous to it means nothing to it, except where this might randomly factor into its calculus of operations. Perpetual revolution, the true powerhouse of the femplex, is preeminently such a device. And being such a device, it would go right on blindly poisoning the world against men and driving the wedge between the sexes deeper and deeper. It would do this because, being what it is, it could do naught other. Up to now, this is all highly predictable, and the next stage is equally predictable. Among other things, we could foresee a continued growth of dysfunctional male behavior. Moreover, a disappearance of the activist element would accelerate such growth by removing a natural set of brakes. And so I pose the question one more time. What would happen if the present crop of pro-male activists and agitators elected to retire from the game and leave it all in the hands of blind fate? I will tell you, the same thing all over again. A fresh crop of activists, agitators, bloggers, and similar characters would rise up in the field and commence the cycle anew. Think about it. Predictable forces generated the first awakening of male political consciousness, and those very same forces would generate another awakening through the very same archetypal patterns of occurrence. There would be nothing at all blind about such fate. What happens when you prune the tree? It puts out new shoots. It is really just that simple. Yes, the awakening of male political consciousness is a force of nature, like water finding a natural egress when it builds up past the point of containment. You cannot stop it. History will repeat itself as often as necessary, and suppression will ultimately fail. You might, in theory, quash the pro-male agitators with clever propaganda, but such a victory would only be a stopgap because the underlying conditions which created pro-male agitators in the first place would only generate more, especially if those conditions got worse, which they predictably would. New preachers and agitators with new arguments would unfailingly arise and kickstart the cycle back to life again. As ever, men would initially recoil against the toxicity of their social environment with no radical insight concerning the what and why of it all. But again, as before, a certain number of cognoscenti would connect the dots and learn to identify feminism specifically as a source of the poison. And of that number, a smaller number would again commence speaking out and sharing their realization with others. And the realization would propagate geometrically among widening circles of listeners. The awakening of male political consciousness will happen again and again. The continued growth of feminist innovation will invariably trigger this awakening whenever the objective nature of the world becomes so evident that the more perceptive cannot fail to make note of it. One thing is certain, the feminists will never change. Come hell or high water, they will move forward with their plans. They will not amend their disposition. At best, they will seem to pull in their horns and govern their tongues for the sake of propriety, when failure to do so would politically compromise them. But they will continue to creep in the night, whenever possible, stealing a march under cover of darkness, quietly smuggling in the parts of their machinery and bolting these into place when nobody is looking, and working doggedly to consolidate their position on every possible front. All of this we know with moral certainty, for it is predictable. Yet we know with equal certainty that the feminists cannot keep their game rolling forever. We know that their fate is sealed, that their game must sooner or later collapse. For what is written, and can only be postponed. Repeatedly, perhaps, but each postponement will exact a greater toll than the one before it, until finally the game implodes in futility. We know that the awakening of male political consciousness has already happened, and having once happened, it will continue on an accelerating growth curve when the pioneering thinkers and explainers pave the way for those who follow. And if all of this revolutionary activity be somehow suspended, renewed feminist innovation will simply bring the pot to a greater boil, whereupon a renewed upwelling will again force the lid. Male political consciousness is bound eventually to reach a critical mass. This can happen either sooner or later, but for the good of all, we should try to make it happen sooner. That is what my conscience tells me. I say try to make it happen, and by that I mean a rational, purposeful effort. And here we arrive at the difference between prediction and prescription. For the things we are describing would happen all by themselves. People, such as the present speaker, would prescribe absolutely nothing. We would merely sit back, watch the parade, and say, "I told you so." We will only have predicted these things. We will not have summoned them into existence. If feminist evolution continues on its present trajectory, these things will happen anyway, and counterfeminism would raise no finger to counteract these developments if such effort would seem to validate feminism's game. By that I mean that we would eschew any rhetorical posture that might strengthen feminism by deflecting accountability away from it, or might seem to infer that others have a duty to make good what feminism has made bad. For example, they may insist that we as men have a duty to oppose misogyny. We would respond that not only have they got no business telling us what our duty is, but given that a continued growth of feminist plans will naturally generate more misogyny, it is accordingly their duty to regulate their own political behavior in that regard, and not fob their work off upon others. No, it is not our responsibility to shoulder the burden for what feminism has wrecked, but only to assist in providing a clearer view of the wreckage. We will hold the lantern while the feminists do the cleanup work, for such work requires an honest light in order that the shape of things be accurately discerned. Yes, counterfeminism is predictive rather than prescriptive. This does not mean that counterfeminism makes no prescriptions, but rather that its prescriptions are informed by its predictions, guided by them, driven by them, contextualized by them, and in nearly every way dependent upon them. And the fact that we predict more than we prescribe makes us the messenger whom they cannot ultimately shoot. Counterfeminism maintains that the movement of men is a broad demographic uprising among a disaffected population, and that this uprising will at times include some unsavory people doing unsavory things. How on earth can a movement involving potentially half the human race remain morally pure like the driven snow? That notion is quixotic. However, the fact that unsavory people are reacting in unsavory ways to the unsavory consequences of feminism's unsavory machinations in no way compromises counter-feminist analysis, but rather confirms and strengthens it. And if such folk be apprehended in their unsavoriness, it is only a matter for the police. That is how it must be, because any feminist effort to deflect blame onto men as a group would only result in more dysfunctional male behavior and more trauma for society as a whole when the consequences of such dysfunction ripple through the social ecology. We may expect male dysfunctionality to assume many forms under the distorting pressure of feminist innovation. Not all of this would involve violence, but all of it would tend to the entropic degradation of the world, and be marked by a state of false consciousness. I mean that men and boys would behave in chaotic or entropic ways because, for want of a guiding theory or conceptual roadmap, they wouldn't know what else to do. They would not recognize what was being done to them, and for want of an identifiable target, they would lash out randomly. This would be unhealthy for society, and we could anticipate, in consequence, much suffering of the innocent. Suffering of the innocent does not please me, and I would like to keep it to a minimum. Male dysfunctionality and male political consciousness stand in diametric opposition. They repel each other. And the good news is that, with the growth of the latter, the former quickly finds the door. To become politically conscious, men must become acutely aware of the interests that unite them as a group, and they must understand that political warfare is being waged against them. Thus enlightened, men may combine their strength in the service of a common good and to the disservice of an objectively real enemy. That objectively real enemy is, of course, feminism. Not feminism as feminist theory defines it, but feminism in real-life terms as the lantern of our accumulated study and experience reveals it. So long as men and boys remain in a dysfunctional state of false consciousness regarding their objective political situation, we can predict chaotic social outcomes and suffering of the innocent. And the longer the growth of male political consciousness is postponed, the worse this will get. And it might get truly nasty. Although male political consciousness will blossom eventually and quite spontaneously, we owe it to ourselves to do what we can to accelerate the growth by deliberate effort, by preaching, and to reduce the lag time as far as might be feasible. That is what my conscience tells me. As if there were any question what a man of conscience should do. Fiedelbogen. Out, 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 out.